Late 1944, the Ardennes forest. It is so cold that men are pulling boots off the bodies of the dead, not out of cruelty, but because their own feet are freezing solid inside their own. Snow falls heavy enough to swallow the sound of a man's voice 3 feet away. And in a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne, a few thousand exhausted American paratroopers are about to be completely surrounded by the largest German offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. Now, before we go one step further, I want you to sit with a question, and I genuinely want your honest answer in the comments because I think it tells you a lot about a person. You are out of ammunition, you are out of food, the medical supplies are gone. The wounded are stacking up, and it's so cold the rifle bolts are freezing shut. The enemy surrounds you on every side and outnumbers you roughly 5-1. And then, one gray morning, they offer you a way out. Do you take it? Hold on to your answer, because the men trapped inside Bastogne were about to be asked that exact question, and the reply one American general scribbled on a piece of paper became a single word the German army would never live down. This is the story of how that word got written. And honestly, by the end, I don't think you'll believe a real general actually said it. To understand how the Americans ended up cornered in a tiny Belgian town, you have to go back to December 16, 1944. By that winter, most people on the Allied side thought the war was basically won. The Germans were retreating, Paris was free, the talk in the foxholes was about being home by spring. So when Hitler threw everything he had left, more than 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks, straight into a quiet, lightly held stretch of the Ardennes, it caught almost everyone flat-footed. The German tanks punched a huge bulge into the American line. That's where the name comes from, the Battle of the Bulge. And right in the path of that hammer blow sat Bastogne. Here's why a town nobody back home had ever heard of suddenly mattered more than almost anything else on the map. 7 major roads met at Bastogne. 7. In that forest, in that snow, an army moves on roads or it doesn't move at all. Whoever held Bastogne held the keys to the whole German advance. So the U.S. Army rushed in the 101st Airborne, paratroopers, the same men who jumped into Normandy, along with tankers and other scraped-together units, and told them to hold a town that was within days completely cut off behind enemy lines. The man left in charge was a brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe, and I want to be fair to him here. He wasn't even supposed to be running the division. The actual commander was back in the United States, so McAuliffe inherited the whole nightmare almost by accident. Surrounded, outnumbered, low on everything. Quick question while we're here, and be honest. If you were handed command of a doomed-looking position you didn't ask for, do you think you'd keep your nerve? Most of us would like to believe we would. McAuliffe actually did. Then came the morning of December 22nd. A young paratrooper named Leo Palma was peering out of his foxhole when he saw something strange moving through the white haze. Figures, walking upright, out in the open where no sane man stood up. As they got closer, he could make them out. 4 German soldiers, 2 officers, 2 enlisted men. One of them was carrying a briefcase under his arm, and above them, tied to a stick, fluttered a piece of white cloth. A white flag. You can imagine what went through the minds of the freezing, half-starved Americans watching them come. Word started rippling down the line, foxhole to foxhole. The enemy's had enough. The Germans are giving up. After days of shelling and dying in the snow, that white flag must have looked like the most beautiful thing in the world. It meant maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. It was not over. And this is the moment the whole story flips. The Germans were blindfolded and walked back to an American command post, and there the message in that briefcase was finally read out. It was not an offer to surrender. It was a demand, a written ultimatum from the German commander, giving the Americans 2 hours to lay down their weapons or face, in his words, total annihilation by artillery. The white flag hadn't come to give up, it had come to tell a surrounded, outgunned American division to quit. Sit with how that lands. You're starving, you're freezing, you're surrounded, and the enemy strolls up under a flag of truce not to surrender, but to politely inform you that you're about to be wiped off the map. According to one account, a German soldier had even written home to his wife that the snow would soon turn red with American blood. That was the mood, that was how certain they were. So the ultimatum is carried to General McAuliffe. And here's the part I love because it's so human it almost sounds made up. McAuliffe had actually been catching some sleep. There's a war on, and the man grabbed rest where he could. Amused, when they woke him and started explaining that the Germans wanted to talk surrender, his first groggy assumption was that the enemy wanted to surrender to him. Reasonable mistake. When a staff officer gently corrected him, "No, sir, it's the other way around. They want us to surrender." Deadpan, McAuliffe just looked at the paper and said, more or less, "Us surrender? Ah, nuts." And then he had a problem, because protocol said you send a formal written reply. Amused, so this general sits down with a pencil, staring at a blank sheet, trying to compose something properly military and defiant for the history books, and he's got nothing. Warm, the story goes that one of his officers finally spoke up and said that first thing he'd blurted out, that would be pretty hard to beat. McAuliffe agreed. So the official reply of the United States Army, typed up neat and clean and carried back across the snow to the German commander, read in full, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." Now, picture the poor German envoy. He carries this slip of paper back, hands it over, and nobody on his side can work out what it means. Nuts? Is that a yes? A no? Some strange American code? By most accounts, the American colonel escorting them, a man named Harper, had to translate it into something they'd understand. Firmly, he told them plainly that it meant the same as "go to hell." It was, when you think about it, an act of almost unbelievable nerve. Grave, McAuliffe didn't have the ammunition to back it up. He didn't have the men. He didn't even have a guarantee anyone was coming to help. He just had the cold and the wounded and a few thousand stubborn paratroopers, and he told the most powerful army on that front to go to hell over a single word. But here's the thing about defiance. The 2-hour clock was real. The artillery the Germans threatened was real, and the moment that envoy walked back across the snow with nuts in his hand, the Germans had their answer, and Bastogne was about to learn what total annihilation actually looked like. So tell me before we go on, if it had been you holding that pencil, would you have written nuts or would you have played for time? Drop it in the comments. I read them. Because while the men inside Bastogne braced for the storm, far to the south, a general the Germans feared more than any other was about to attempt something every textbook said was impossible. His name was Patton, and what he did next is where this story truly begins. When that German envoy carried the word nuts back across the snow, the answer was clear, and the 2-hour clock ran out. Grave. The artillery the Germans had promised was not a bluff. It came down on Bastogne in waves, high explosive, walking through the streets, through the foxholes, through the field hospital. Steady. The men of the 101st pressed themselves into the frozen earth and took it. Tank attacks came at the perimeter from multiple directions, probing for the soft spot. There wasn't one. The paratroopers held. Reflective. But holding is a thin word for what it cost. They were rationing artillery shells to a handful per gun per day. The wounded were piling up with almost no medical supplies. And the one thing that could have saved them, air support, resupply from the sky, was useless because the entire sky was a low gray lid of cloud that hadn't lifted in days. Intriguing. And this is where the story turns in a way that's almost too good to be true. Because Patton, miles to the south, had reportedly asked his chaplain weeks earlier to write a prayer for good weather. The men passed it around. Building. And on December 23rd, as if on cue, the clouds broke. The sky over Bastogne turned a hard, clean blue. Within hours, transport planes were roaring overhead, dumping ammunition, food, and medical supplies by parachute to the men below, and Allied fighter bombers were finally tearing into the German positions. Light rye. Now, I'm not telling you a prayer turned the war, but you have to admit, for a freezing, surrounded division running on empty, the timing was something. What do you think? Luck? Or the most well-timed weather report in military history? Tell me in the comments. Now, let's go back in time a few days and 100 miles south to a room that's about to witness one of the boldest promises ever made by an American general. December 19, 1945, the senior Allied commanders gathered at Verdun to figure out how to stop the German breakthrough. Grave. The mood was grim. The bulge was growing. Steady. And then the Supreme Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, turned and asked Patton a simple question. How soon could his Third Army stop what it was doing, turn north, and attack into the side of the German advance to relieve Bastogne? Understand what was actually being asked. Patton's army was pointed east, locked in a fight. To do what Eisenhower wanted, Patton would have to disengage an entire army mid-battle, swing it 90 degrees onto icy winter roads, and drive it 100 miles north, in the cold, in the snow, against the clock. An army is not a car. You don't just signal and turn left. Steady. By every rule of logistics, that kind of maneuver takes weeks. Low, deliberate. Patton said he could attack in 48 hours. Narrative. According to the accounts of men who were in that room, there was a silence. A few of them reportedly thought he was bluffing or boasting or had lost his mind. Turn. But here's the thing the skeptics didn't know. Explanatory. Patton's intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been quietly warning for weeks that the Germans were massing for exactly this kind of blow. Building. So while others were caught flat-footed, Patton had already had his staff draft the plans for a turn north. Firm. He wasn't promising a miracle, he was promising something he'd already done the homework for. Low. And then he walked out and made his army prove it. If you're the kind of person who'd rather hear what actually happened than a comfortable made-up legend, that's the entire reason this channel exists. So if the real, unvarnished history of war is your thing, take a second and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps. Now, back to the road. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of the entire war, and it doesn't involve a single dramatic duel. It involves trucks and frozen fingers and traffic. Tens of thousands of men and machines wheeled out of one battle and rumbled north through a Belgian winter, headlights blacked out, roads sheeted in ice, signposts down. Patton drove the column himself, up and down the line, swearing, pushing, refusing to let it stall. It was, in its own grinding way, just as much an act of nerve as anything happening inside Bastogne. At the tip of the spear was the 4th Armored Division, and leading one of its tank battalions was a lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, a name some of you might recognize because decades later the U.S. Army would name its main battle tank after him. Abrams's tanks clawed north through village after village, each one defended, each one costing time and blood the men in Bastogne didn't have to spare. Then came December 26th. In the late afternoon, the lead American tanks finally crested toward the southern edge of the Bastogne perimeter.
The first tank through, commanded by a young lieutenant named Charles Bodges, rolled cautiously toward a line of figures dug in ahead and realized they were American engineers of the 101st. The corridor was open. After days completely cut off, surrounded, shelled, and written off, the men who answered an entire German army with the word nuts watched friendly tanks roll into their lines. The siege ring was broken. It wasn't the end of the fighting. The men of the 101st would hold that line deep into January, and plenty of them would tell you with a straight face that they never needed rescuing in the first place. But the trap had been sprung open. The gamble had paid. McAuliffe's defiance and Patton's impossible turn had met in the snow at Bastogne, and together they'd held the most important crossroads on the Western Front. So let's sit with what this story is really about, because it's not about one clever trick, it's about nerve. McAuliffe had nothing in his hand, no ammo, no reinforcements, no guarantee, and he bet everything on the word nuts. Patton stood in a room full of doubters and promised something that sounded impossible, then went out and dragged an entire army through the ice to make it true. Neither man waited for the situation to feel safe. Neither man waited for permission to believe his people could do the hard thing. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in the snow at Bastogne. Battles aren't only won by numbers or machines. Sometimes they're won by the stubborn refusal of a few exhausted people to admit they're beaten. So, here's my question for you, and I really do want your verdict in the comments. What won Bastogne? McAuliffe's defiance on the inside, or Patton's near-impossible drive from the outside? Which one was the real difference? Make your case below. I read every one of them. And if you want to see what happened to Patton himself in the strange, still debated months that followed this campaign, tap the video on your screen right now. Thanks for watching.